All right, everyone. So now that we finished with this activity, we did the warm-up activity on the graffiti board where you're all supposed to provide your own input, your own ideas around these questions. The questions were, how would the country operate if each state could make its own decisions instead of a national government, right? That means the national government having a lot less power than it does today, as spelled out by our Constitution. Would America be the same as it is today? Would it be as strong as it is today? And then I asked you to apply it sort of in your more familiar context, right? Which is the classroom. If you were expected to get an education, but there was no teacher, or there was a teacher, but she had a lot less authority and a lot more limitations in what she could do and how she could guide you, how would your education be different? How would your experiences be different? And you guys gave me some very interesting answers. It helped you think about how complicated it must have been for Americans who are now independent and free from the Revolutionary War to make such big decisions about what government's going to look like, right? So we have the Constitution that we consider to be a successful piece of document that led us to, a nation that gained a lot of strength globally. But they had some rough patches, okay, right before that. So we're going to talk about that today in our lecture. At any point, if you have any questions, make sure you type them up. I'll receive them on Padlet. I'm going to answer them as best as I can, but I want you all to be engaged. If you're confused at any point, send me the questions, write a comment, and we'll address them as we go along. I'm also going to be asking you some questions, so please have your tablets out and be ready to answer when that time comes. So we're at a point now where America is an independent nation. We just won the Revolutionary War, or, not immediately, but we're a little bit past that point. So what will this new country look like? What will this new government look like? That's where we're at right now. And it's a very big job to now be without a government, know that you're independent. You don't have any mother country kind of guiding you. You're on your own, but you have to develop a functioning government to be able to survive and to be able to have everything run properly, whether it be the economy, whether it be warfare. There's a lot of things that go into it. So what we're going to be learning today are these points here: the Wilderness Road, the Land Ordinance of 1785, Northwest Territory, the Articles of Confederation, and we won't have time for Shays Rebellion, but we'll touch on it tomorrow. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the Articles of Confederation. Okay. So first of all, we already know the 13 established colonies and a way that they were, each colony had their own vision and philosophy in the way that it ran and governed its people. But there were more and more Europeans coming annually to these colonies and to now the states that wanted a better life. And there was just not enough space in those 13 colonies, and they wanted their own land. They wanted their own opportunities to grow and have, a prosperous future. So there was an opportunity at some point where this man, okay, called Dr. Thomas Walker in 1750, discovered this little gap between some mountains called the Cumberland Gap. And he discovered that it was actually formed naturally by an ancient creek. It was about 12 miles long, and it was all surrounded by mountains. So this trail became a very important route for westward expansion. It was one of the first routes, and it's what encouraged settlement further west. Okay. And right, and told them to bring their axes in hand, and they started kind of hacking their ways across the mountains, creating a path that would be known as the Wilderness Road. And the path still exists today. After 2 weeks, Boone and his men made it to the other side of the mountains, and they chose a spot for this new settlement. And instead of naming the colony after this wealthy businessman, Richard Henderson, who had hired him to make a colony after him, to create a colony after him, Boone decided to call it after himself, and he called it Boonesboro, which is pretty interesting, right? especially when he was financed by somebody else to do so. But it was really the start of this westward expansion, and a lot more settlers started coming in. These hundreds of pioneers started to join them. After the 13 colonies had essentially declared their independence, they felt that it was time to also start establishing governments, right? That's important. If we're going to be independent, we got to know how we're going to govern our people and be sovereign in a successful way, right? So what did they do? Each of the states started to create their own governments. Some states experimented with having separate branches of government. So when we go into studying the Constitution, understanding how our government works, we'll also understand what that means, having separate branches of government. What they all had in common was choosing a Republican form of government. Now, we briefly talked about it in the last class, okay? But we are going to go in detail about the different types of governments that exist, right? What's the difference between direct democracy versus a Republican form of government versus an authoritarian government, right? So they all wanted a Republican form of government. They thought that that was the healthiest way to create and establish a democratic foundation for the nation. I have a couple of vocabulary words up here. So framers are the creators. We're going to hear a lot about that when we talk about the Constitution, right? The framers were the ones who created the Constitution. And a republic, independent, Britain is no longer the government that represents you. You're on your own. You need a government. And they thought it was important to have not just state governments, but unify under a national government. And this was really hard to do, because most Americans thought that the moment that you have a national government, your powers, because each state thought different things, they had different philosophies in the way they wanted to be governed. They were afraid that if we have one central government basically telling all states what to do, that it would just turn out to be the same scenario as life under the British, where it would be authoritarian and oppressive. But the philosophy was that you also, if you don't have a central government, you can't stay united and be able to coexist with other nations around the world, because it's not just you. You're not alone in the world. You're going to have to trade with other nations. You're going to have to create diplomatic relations with other nations. You can't do that with states divided, or can you? They had to figure that out. So while states were setting up their governments, the Continental Congress started to think of ideas of the ways they can create a national government. They had a lot of disagreements, whether each state should have one vote or voting should be based on population. This was a big one. So today, before I do my last slide, I just want to tell you what's going to be happening today. So today you will be working in the pre-assigned groups that I gave you at the beginning of class, okay, to study the Articles of Confederation and fill in your graphic organizer about what were the weaknesses and strengths of this document, of this first Constitution. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about it here, but we're also going to study it in detail, and then we're going to have a discussion about it. So the Articles of Confederation were, or was, our first Constitution. Okay, so this was the final plan. Here are some things that it had on it. So this is what we're going to be looking at today, the Articles of Confederation. The whole point of giving more power to the states was the avoidance of having a tyrannical government. Okay, they did not want to relive what they lived under the British government, which in their point of view was tyranny. They thought that they were tyrannical, they didn't have a say, and this was true. Remember, we talked about how they didn't have representation in Parliament. Well, in a way, I guess you can view it as tyrannical when you don't have a voice in your own Parliament. So to avoid that, they gave most of the powers to the states. All right. Okay. So we are now finished with a lecture. You're going to reposition yourselves according to, you're going to be in tables of 4 according to the groups that I spelled out at the beginning of class. You have your graphic organizers that I passed out today. You have your paper with the Articles of Confederation, and you have your questions in front of you. So we're going to talk about, you guys in your groups are going to discuss what are the possible conflicts that could arise based on each section of the Articles of Confederation. You're going to discuss it in your group. You're going to write it down in your graphic organizer, and then you're going to present at least one of those points to the rest of the class in about 10 minutes. I think I gave you 10 minutes. If we need to go a little bit over that, that's fine. And I want to see if we all agree on the points that you guys brought up. Okay. All right. I'm going to be walking around to help everybody. Let's get started.